Weimar Germany, November 1923. A loaf of bread costs 200 billion marks. Your bank account that could buy a house in 1918 can't buy bread in 1923. 5 years. That's all it took for a stable currency to become worthless paper. But some people didn't just survive. They thrived. How? They followed 5 principles that work in every collapse regardless of cause, country, or century. Argentina 2001, the peso is frozen. Banks close their doors, you can't access your own deposits. The government confiscates dollar accounts and forcibly converts them to pesos at a rigged exchange rate. 66% of your savings vanishes overnight. But some people survived. They followed the same principles people followed in Weimar and Rome in every collapse throughout history. America 2025. The national debt stands at $36 trillion. The currency has lost 98% of its purchasing power since 1913. The Federal Reserve created $5 trillion in just 2 years. The system is following the exact same pattern that preceded every currency collapse in history. When the collapse comes, whether in 5 years or 15, these same principles will determine who survives and who loses everything. Here are the 5 financial principles that have survived every collapse in recorded history. Why they work when everything else fails. The specific historical examples proving each principle, and how to apply them right now before the window closes. Understanding this isn't about getting rich. It's about not losing everything. Because in every collapse, most people lose everything. Not because they were stupid, but because they followed tactics that work in normal times but fail catastrophically in crisis. These 5 principles worked in Rome. They worked in Weimar. They'll work in America. Why principles matter more than tactics. Before I show you the 5 principles, you need to understand why principles matter more than tactics. A tactic is specific advice: buy gold, sell stocks. These might work or they might not. It depends on timing, on the specific type of collapse, on 1,000 variables. A principle is a fundamental truth that works regardless. Principles worked in Rome when gold was money. They worked in Weimar when paper was money. They'll work in America whether the collapse is hyperinflation, deflation, or currency reset. Most financial advice is tactical. Buy this stock, put 60% in stocks and 40% in bonds. These tactics assume the system continues functioning. They assume banks remain solvent, governments honor contracts, and property rights are enforced. In a collapse, all those assumptions break, but the principles remain. Principle 1. Hard assets survive. Paper burns. When currency collapses, when governments default, when the financial system breaks, physical assets retain value because they're real. Paper assets, anything that's a claim on something else, go to zero because the claim becomes unenforceable. Weimar Germany, 1918 to 1923. If you held 100,000 marks in a bank account in 1918, you were wealthy. By 1923, that 100,000 marks couldn't buy a loaf of bread. The currency inflated into worthlessness. Paper wealth vaporized. But people who owned hard assets, land, buildings, factories, survived. A farm in 1918 was still a farm in 1923. It grew the same food. It had the same value in real terms. The mark price went from 100,000 to 100 trillion. But the farm itself didn't change. Zimbabwe 2000's hyperinflation reached 79.6 billion% per month in 2008. If you held savings in Zimbabwean dollars, they became worthless. But people who owned farmland, livestock, and equipment preserved their wealth. The land produced food regardless of what happened to the currency. Argentina 2001-2002. The government froze bank accounts, then forcibly converted dollar deposits to pesos at 1.4 to 1. The peso then fell to 4 to 1. People who held money in banks lost 2/3 of their wealth. But people who owned property, land, and physical goods retained value. Same principle across 3 collapses. Hard assets survive. Paper burns. In America 2025, most wealth is held in paper assets. Stocks, bonds, retirement accounts, bank deposits. These are all claims. A stock is a claim on corporate earnings. A bond is a claim on repayment. A bank deposit is a claim on the bank's promise. In stable times, these claims work. But in collapse, the system stops functioning. Courts are overwhelmed, banks fail. Governments default, markets freeze. Paper claims become worthless, but hard assets remain. Real estate is still real estate. Gold is still gold. A farm still produces food. The asset has intrinsic value independent of the financial system. When the collapse comes, paper burns. Hard assets survive. Principle 2. Own productive assets, not speculative assets. This principle distinguishes between assets that produce value and assets that only have value because someone else will pay more later. Productive assets generate income, food, or utility, independent of what anyone else thinks. Speculative assets only have value if you can sell them. The Great Depression, 1929-1933. The stock market collapsed 89%. If you owned stocks for speculation, you lost almost everything. But if you owned productive assets directly, a farm, rental property, a business, you received the production. A farm produced food you could eat or sell. Rental property provided housing people needed. A business produced goods people needed. Productive assets generate value independent of market price. A farm produces food whether the stock market is at 381 or 41. Speculative assets only have value if you can sell them. And in a collapse, there are no buyers. Venezuela 2010s. The stock market went up 100,000% in believers. Sounds good until you realize the believer lost 99.9% of its value. Stock prices meant nothing, but people who owned productive assets, farms, bakeries, transportation, thrived relatively. A bakery produced bread. People desperately needed bread. The bakery created value. Contrast this with Venezuelan government bonds. They only had value if the government honored them. The government defaulted. The bonds went to zero. In America 2025, most assets are speculative. The S&P 500 is valuable because people believe it will go up. Bitcoin produces nothing. It's valuable because people believe others will pay more later. Most real estate is speculative, bought to flip or appreciate. Productive assets are different. A farm that grows food is productive. A rental property you own free and clear is productive. A business that produces goods people need is productive. When collapse comes, speculation collapses, production remains. Own things that produce value. The farm feeds you. The rental provides shelter. The business creates goods. Speculation doesn't. Principle 3. Debt destroys you in collapse, even good debt. In stable times, debt is leverage. You borrow to buy a house, it appreciates, you profit. But in collapse, all debt is bad debt. Your income drops or disappears, but your debt doesn't. The bank still demands payment. If you can't pay, they take the asset. The Great Depression. Farmers had borrowed to expand during the 1920s. Land prices were rising. Borrowing made sense. Then 1929 hit, crop prices collapsed. Farm income fell 50 to 70%. But the bank debt didn't decrease. Between 1930 and 1935, over 750,000 farms were foreclosed. Families who owned land for generations lost everything because of debt. Compare this to farmers who owned land free and clear. They struggled, prices were terrible, but they survived. Without debt payments, they lived on whatever the farm produced. They ate the food they grew. They survived on almost no cash income. Debt-free farmers survived. Indebted farmers lost everything. Argentina, 2001. Middle-class families had mortgages denominated in dollars. When the peso collapsed, peso income fell 66%, but the mortgage stayed the same in dollars. People's income fell by 2/3, but their debt payment didn't change. They couldn't pay, banks foreclosed. People lost homes they'd been paying on for 10, 15 years. Meanwhile, people who owned homes free and clear kept their homes. Same crisis, same income drop, but no debt meant no foreclosure. Greece 2010's incomes fell 30-40%. Pensions were cut 50%. But people with mortgages still owed the same amount. Default rates spiked. Debt destroyed them. In America 2025, Americans hold $17 trillion in household debt, $12 trillion in mortgages, $1.6 trillion in auto loans, $1.6 trillion in student loans, $1 trillion in credit cards. When the crisis comes, that debt will destroy millions of families. The counterargument is that inflation helps debtors. If you owe $300,000 and inflation runs 20%, your debt decreases in real terms. This is true if your income keeps up, but in real collapses it doesn't. In Weimar, yes, debtors benefited if they kept their jobs, but unemployment hit 30%. If you lost your job, the debt destroyed you regardless of inflation. In Argentina, inflation would have helped, except wages were frozen while prices soared. Debt payments stayed the same while income collapsed. The theory says inflation helps debtors. Reality says collapses destroy income and debt requires income. The only safe position is zero debt. Own assets free and clear. If you own a house with a mortgage, you don't own a house. You own a leveraged bet that house prices stay high and your income stays steady. If either assumption breaks, you lose the house. If you own a house free and clear, you own a house. Period. No bank can take it. You need food and property taxes, but you don't need to service debt. That's the difference between surviving and losing everything. Debt is leverage and expansion. Debt is suicide and collapse. Principle 4. Skills are the only truly portable wealth. Every other form of wealth can be taken. Land can be seized, gold confiscated, money inflated, businesses nationalized. But skills stay with you, they're in your brain. They can't be taxed, confiscated, or inflated away. The Holocaust. Jewish families owned property, businesses, wealth, all confiscated by the Nazis. But the Jews who survived often survived because of skills. Doctors, engineers, craftsmen, tailors, people with skills could work. They could trade labor for food. They could rebuild in new countries. The wealthy merchant who owned property but had no skills starved. The skilled craftsman who owned nothing but knew how to build survived and rebuilt. Soviet Union, 1917-1922. The Bolsheviks seized all private property. Aristocrats who owned vast estates lost everything overnight. But engineers, doctors, skilled workers maintained value. The Soviet state needed them. Their skills gave them leverage even under communism. The aristocrat who owned 10,000 acres but couldn't farm starved. The blacksmith who owned nothing but could make tools survived. Vietnam, 1975. When Saigon fell, millions fled. They couldn't take property. They couldn't take businesses. Gold was dangerous. If found at checkpoints, it was confiscated. The Vietnamese refugees who rebuilt most successfully in America were those with skills. Doctors, engineers, accountants, mechanics. They arrived with nothing but their skills. Within a generation, they built successful lives. Contrast with wealthy Vietnamese who owned factories and land. They lost everything and had no skills to rebuild. Many never recovered. In America 2025, most wealth is in financial assets and real estate. These are not portable. If you need to leave, you can't take your house. You might not be able to take money if capital controls are implemented. But skills in your head go with you everywhere. Skills are the foundation of rebuildable wealth. You can lose everything material and rebuild if you have skills. Without skills, you can't rebuild. But most Americans have no practical skills. The average person can't grow food, can't fix machines, can't build shelter, can't provide medical care. They have specialized corporate skills that only work in complex economies. When systems simplify and collapse, complex skills become less valuable. Simple, practical skills become essential. Can you grow food, fix machines, build shelter, provide medical care? These are valuable skills in every economy, stable or collapsed. A software engineer who can't do anything practical is helpless in collapse. A farmer who understands soil and plants and seasons creates value in any situation. Develop skills that produce value independent of complex systems. Skills are wealth you always carry. Everything else can be taken. Principle 5. Local trust networks outlast all institutions. When systems collapse, institutions fail. Banks close, governments lose authority. Police can't enforce laws. The entire institutional framework breaks down, but local networks of trusted relationships survive. The Soviet Union collapsed 1991-1998. The Soviet government dissolved. The currency became worthless. Pensions stopped, supply chains broke, grocery stores were empty. How did Russians survive? Through local networks. Families shared resources, neighbors traded. Communities organized security and shared resources. The people who survived best weren't the wealthiest. They were people embedded in strong local networks. The isolated individual with money in the bank starved. The connected person with relationships thrived. Argentina, 2001. When banks closed, neighborhood assemblies formed. People organized locally to barter, share resources, provide security. These informal networks became more important than government. People embedded in these networks could trade skills for food, labor for goods. The isolated person couldn't access frozen bank accounts and had no alternatives. The connected person participated in local trade networks and survived. Lebanon, 2019-present, the pound lost 90% of its value. Banks closed. The government became dysfunctional. But Lebanon hasn't descended into chaos. Why? Because Lebanon is organized around family and religious community networks. These networks provide what the government doesn't: capital, security, arbitration, social services. Lebanese don't rely on government because they never could. They rely on networks. When the government failed, life continued because the networks held. Before modern institutions, all economic activity happened through trust networks. You traded with people you knew. You borrowed from people who knew you'd repay. You relied on family and community for security and support. Modern institutions scale beyond local trust. You can borrow from a bank that doesn't know you because the legal system enforces contracts. You can trade with strangers because police enforce property rights. You rely on government for security. But when institutions fail, we revert to trust networks. In collapse, you can't rely on police, courts, or government. You rely on people who know you and have reciprocal relationships with you. In America 2025, most people are institutionally embedded but locally isolated. You have a bank account but don't know your neighbors. You rely on Walmart for food but don't know local farmers. You rely on police but don't know your neighborhood. Your relationships are distant, scattered family, online friends, work colleagues. This is catastrophically fragile. When institutions fail, you have no fallback. Build local networks now. Know your neighbors. Develop reciprocal relationships. Embed yourself in a community. Join local organizations, trade favors. Build trust. When institutions fail, the person with strong local networks has alternatives. The isolated individual has nothing. In Soviet collapse, the apartment building where everyone knew each other organized communal meals and security. The apartment building of strangers saw theft and chaos. In Argentina, neighborhoods with strong community ties organized successfully. Neighborhoods of isolated individuals struggled. As institutional trust fails, local trust becomes more valuable. The person with strong local networks will survive. The isolated individual will struggle. These are the 5 principles. 1. Hard assets survive, paper burns. 2. Own productive assets, not speculative. 3. Debt destroys and collapse. 4. Skills are portable wealth. 5. Local networks outlast institutions. Notice what's not on this list. Which specific stocks to buy, which cryptocurrency to hold, whether gold or silver is better. These are tactics. They might matter, but they're secondary. The principles work regardless. They worked in Rome. They worked in Weimar. They'll work in America. The beauty of principles is they don't require perfect timing. You don't need to know exactly when the collapse comes. You position according to principles that survive collapse. Own hard assets instead of paper. The collapse could come in 2030 or 2040. Doesn't matter. Hard assets preserve wealth in both stable times and crisis. Own productive assets. If the system stays stable, productive assets generate income. If it collapses, you have production, eliminate debt. In stable times, you have financial resilience. In collapse, you survive while debtors lose everything. Develop skills. In stable times, skills increase income. In collapse, skills become your only portable wealth. Build local networks. In stable times, you have community and relationships. In collapse, you have survival infrastructure. These principles improve your life now and protect you later. The mistake most people make is waiting for certainty. They want to know exactly when the collapse comes. They want proof it's happening. They want someone to tell them, sell everything on Tuesday, buy gold on Wednesday. But collapses don't announce themselves. By the time it's obvious, it's too late. By the time everyone knows the banks are failing, you can't get your money out. By the time hyperinflation is obvious, prices have already exploded. The genius of following principles is they don't require prediction. You position according to what survives collapse, and you're protected regardless of timing. If the collapse comes in 5 years, you're prepared. If it comes in 20 years, you lived a more resilient life in the meantime. If it never comes, you're better off anyway. No debt, productive assets, valuable skills, strong community. These 5 principles are ancient. They've survived 3,000 years because they're true in every economic system. Roman Empire, medieval Europe, Industrial Revolution, modern America. The principles don't change because human nature doesn't change and mathematics don't change. When debt exceeds the ability to pay, collapse follows. When currency is debased, paper wealth evaporates. When institutions fail, local networks matter. These patterns repeat because they're based on unchanging realities. The American collapse will follow the same patterns. The specific details will differ. Our collapse won't look exactly like Weimar or Argentina, but the principles remain. The tactics that work this time will be specific to our situation, but the principles remain universal. Hard assets survive. Productive assets generate value. Debt destroys. Skills are portable. Local networks outlast institutions. These principles worked in Rome when the denarius was debased. They worked in Weimar when the mark hyperinflated. They worked in Argentina when the peso collapsed. They'll work in America regardless of whether we face inflation, deflation, or currency reset. Position according to these principles now, and you survive what's coming. Ignore them and follow tactics, and you're gambling that you can time the collapse perfectly. That's a bet most people lose. In every collapse, the people who survive aren't the ones who predicted the exact timing. They're the ones who positioned according to principles that work regardless. If this showed you that principles matter more than tactics, that the same 5 principles have survived every collapse in history, and that you can position right now without needing to predict exact timing, subscribe, because the next video will show you the specific tactics that align with these principles in 2025 America. Which hard assets make sense in a digital economy? Which productive assets generate value in modern markets? How to eliminate debt strategically? Which skills are most valuable? And how to build local networks in an isolated society? The principles tell you what to do. The tactics tell you how. These 5 principles worked in Rome, in Weimar, in Argentina. In every collapse, they'll work in America. The only question is whether you'll follow them before the window closes, or whether you'll wish you had after it's too late.